Okay, students, let me set my timer. And I think where I was giving you some statistics about employment patterns for students who have gone through transition services. And I know I was saying that, you know, the better the level of education the student gets, the higher the chances they have for remaining employed, being employed, and that's really an important factor for them, especially in terms of quality of life. So the next category that I want to give you just general information about is community involvement. And this is another quality of life issue that's quite important for us to consider. And so community involvement means essentially, you know, is this special needs young adult able to participate in community events? Can they go to a parade? Do they volunteer? Are they a member of a faith community? What do they do for recreation? Do they enjoy any sports? Do they participate in fitness activities? All of those kinds of things are related to community involvement. And so I want to just give you some statistical information about what this looks like. And it very much, of course, depends on the kind of, level of impairment that this student experiences. So somebody, of course, with severe intellectual impairment is not going to have maybe as high a level of community involvement as maybe a student who has another kind of maybe mild intellectual impairment. But the range statistically is from 20% of them being involved with community activities to 82%. So 82% is pretty darn high. But I want to caution us to understand that 82%, that level is probably for students who maybe are mild, maybe who have Asperger's syndrome, or who are, perhaps less impaired, I'm guessing. But it's this community involvement piece for quality of life is really important in terms of planning and assuring services for. So how does transition planning get accomplished? This is covered in your textbook starting on page 501, and I might just turn to those pages. I like to make references with you sometimes about that. It is something that is required by the IDEA laws, and so there's a whole separate body of requirements for these students under IDEA. And so it should begin no later than age 16 and be a part of the student's IEP program. And so in some states this starts to happen at age 14, but and that would be, of course, junior high school. And from what I understand from the reading, having this occur, in junior high school and having students really have exposure to kind of pre-employment behaviors is really, really predictive of how well they'll do when they are in high school and are actually placed out on job sites. So some pre-employment behaviors that junior high students might get involved with would be things like setting an alarm and then getting up, training themselves to get up on time, keeping a schedule and showing up on schedule where they're supposed to be. You can see how these small behaviors would be great habits to develop in a junior high student with special needs, who then is going to, in high school, be trained to do a lot of other things that are related to being a good employee. Let's see, in 2004, IDEA refined the whole transition process, and you should know that this transition process does involve the student having what are called measurable goals. And if you want to see, I hope I'm skipping around on my notes a little bit, but I hope that page 503 is the page that shows you 503, 502 shows you sort of a schematic of the process, the transition planning process, so you can see, what needs to be done first, and then what happens, and then what happens. And then if you flip over to page 503, you'll see that there are 3 different students described, and they have 3 different levels of impairment. And you can see, what kinds of goals are specific to, it's sampling of what goals would look like. And goals have to have some very particular elements in them. So just as you know what an IEP should contain, this process of involving the student themselves to the degree that they can be involved, involving the parents of the student as well, finding out what the student really is interested in, and then planning very specific ways that these goals will be met is key to the whole IEP/transition planning process. So the first stage of this process, if we flip now back, I think I might have misspoken about the page, page 502, starts with age-appropriate assessment. And this, involves multiple ways of trying to find out what the student's strengths are, what their academic abilities are. For example, what is their reading level? What kind of math can they do? Can they make change? Can they recognize different, denominations of bills, paper money? And, so you're looking a little bit at objective measures of the student's skills. But then also, this student needs to be assessed for what they think might be interesting and what they might want to do or try out or explore. And so a student who really likes plants might say, I think I'd like to try working at a garden center or at a big place where plants are planted in little tiny pods, that get fed onto big stores like Walmart and Lowe's. And so this assessment really needs to follow, really needs to follow ability levels, learning levels, but very much what they're interested in. So we want to look at what the client's strengths and interests are. Also, it's pretty important at this stage to not just think about what the student wants to do, what their big dream is, but also to be really realistic about any barriers that might stand in the way, or barriers that need to be worked around or overcome. So I don't want to make it sound like we would say to a student, oh, you can't do that. What we really want to try to find out is, oh, you're interested in that. Let's find ways for you to get exposed to that sort of work. And maybe we can even construct or have the employer construct a particular job that allows you to do something in this field that fits you and suits you. So this assessment is done in, I've sort of been talking about objective measures and, information about what the student likes. So there's kind of this formal part of the process, which could involve assessment instruments or testing, right? But then there's this informal process additionally, which could be interviews with parents or observation reports from teachers that the student has had. Could be anecdotal records, also are mentioned in the textbook about this. But I think you're getting the idea of what assessment really needs to look like for these students, and it should be the very first step. I did mention to you earlier that IEP requires that the student's transition planning, contains measurable goals. And these goals, there have to be at least one goal for each post-secondary part of their life. So let me say that again. There has to be at least, at a minimum, one goal for each post-secondary part of the student's life. So what's a post-secondary part of the student's life? If you think about that, you could probably tell me, but we certainly are talking here about employment, right? We've already been talking about their education or any additional training. I sort of talked about that briefly. We'll talk about that some more. And then the third area is their independent living, their residential situation and community involvement, self-care, those kinds of things. So IDEA requires that the student's IEP contain measurable goals that are part of at least one of three aspects of their life. I'm not sure I'm saying that right, but there has to be one goal for, at least one goal for each of those three aspects of the student's life that I mentioned: their education and training, their employment, and independent living. So they have to be really specific, and if you remember back when we actually did goal setting in our interviewing class in year 1 of your program, you remember that I really pushed you to make sure that these goals that you came up with for your client were measurable and observable. And all goal setting really in counseling and in education is very, very much structured this way. It is just how it's done. So make sure that you understand that. And then figure 2 on page 503 does show some goals. Again, I'm mentioning this to you, and each goal has to have a time frame. So remember, we want to lock in that this is actually going to happen. And so there needs to be some mentioning of how long it's going to take to do this goal, or when this goal is going to be accomplished. Those of you who are in internship probably remember, I hope you remember, when you started with your paperwork in internship, I worked with you to come up with some goals. And I really usually push my students to come up with a goal that will happen in the first couple of months of their internship, and then a goal that's related to the middle of their internship, and something that they could conceivably hope to achieve by the end of their internship. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of having a time frame. So each of these goals has to have a time frame. It also has to have a clear, observable behavior. And if you read the goals on page 503, I'll just see if I can pick one up really quick on page 503 and see if we can identify what the clear, observable behavior is. So looking at Allison, who's the 18-year-old student with LD, under the employment area, the goal says, after college, Allison will be employed in the field of early childhood education. So the clear observable behavior is be employed. So either she is employed or she's not employed. We can tell if this goal happened. And so in writing this goal, her teacher has said after college, that's the time frame, Allison will be employed. And then the setting is the last piece of this, and so in early childhood education is the setting for Allison in this example. So I think you're getting the idea of how detailed this transition planning IEP needs to be and what these measurable goals must look like. Let's see. I have in my notes, this process of IEP goal construction helps bring the student's needs to reality, including agencies or employers outside of the school environment. So ideally, the specificity continues to, assure that the student receives proper instruction and support, even if they're, the goal is related to an employment training situation that they're in still well in high school. So you might, I don't know if you know this, but many of these students might spend 25% of their day at school learning things like appropriate social behavior, but also learning academic things. And then a larger portion, maybe 50 to 75% of their time, really is supposed to be out in the big world, in a job site, being able to practice proper employment behaviors and learning employment-related skills. So you can see examples of this I wrote in my notes on page 505. So I guess we'll go over some of that in the lecture. Again, thinking about Allison, this 18-year-old who has LD. So she's not hugely impaired probably, right? Her IEP goal that I might mention to you is, let's see how I want to talk about this. Allison will develop algebra skills as measured by her homework completion and quiz scores, and by using a planner to record assignments and prepare questions for class. So her employment goal is contingent upon her completion of college. Therefore, annual goals that support her college completion also support her employment goal. And remember, Allison wants to work in preschool education. So the finishing and mastering of basic mathematical principles is something that's going to get her out of her college level math and into a teaching program. What happens when students leave public school? Let's talk about that a little bit. They, upon leaving school, they're given a document that's called an SOP, or a summary of performance. And, oops, shoot, there goes my timer. A summary of performance tells what the student is capable of, maybe what levels of reading and mathematical functioning they have. Also, the SOP does give information about their functional performance. What things can they do? Can they, when we think about functional, living, we think about taking care of oneself, feeding oneself, using a telephone, maybe looking something up on the internet. And so the SOP gives that kind of data to somebody who then might be wanting to further educate the student, or maybe somebody who's actually going to employ the student. Okay, I've got to stop the camera here, but I'll pick it right back up.